My father was stationed at the Vancouver Barracks. He was active Guard Reserve, and I was born in 1962 in Vancouver. And so as a kid, I grew up playing around the barracks. And when I was 17, I joined the Army Reserves at the Vancouver Barracks. About almost 30 years later, as the U.S. Army left in 2011, 2010, and so I actually did a full career. I started as a private in the infantry, and after then a 3-year enlistment, I got my commission. And you stay in any job long enough, and you take on different jobs and different positions, different education. I have a bachelor's in anthropology and a master's in archaeology, and I was a credentialed military historian, and I deployed as such. Now, coming back from Afghanistan, I ended up joining my old Army Reserve unit, and I was their historian. And before the Army left, of course, they built new facility at what's now known as Joint Base Lewis McChord, and I was able to commute. And so I maintained an office at the Vancouver Barracks. And to the best of my knowledge, I was the last soldier serving there before the Army left. The barracks have been divided a couple times over the decades, and currently what everybody thinks is the Vancouver Barracks, if you visit, most of it is owned by the National Park Service, but the city of Vancouver owns a portion of the barracks too. And some other smaller bits and pieces have been kind of divided up. The Post Cemetery, which is the third cemetery consecrated on the barracks, actually is a national cemetery now. So the VA owns that slice of it, and some of which I can talk about, but just like Fort Steilacoom, there's so much history, we only have about an hour. So I'm going to launch into the beginnings of the Vancouver Barracks. I'm going to share my screen and start my little PowerPoint. And entire screen, I should be shared, and PowerPoint from beginning. Is it coming across?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. I am a member of the Vancouver Barracks Military Association. Now, we formed the VBMA as the Army was getting ready to leave. A bunch of us veterans, disgruntled and otherwise, got together, and we ended up kind of saying, what the National Park Service does a good job of what they're doing, but also displays and pamphlets and things like that. As some of you who are members of your society up there will know, it takes a little bit of time working through government. So we also said, as veterans, we have a perspective that's probably unique from the average person. So we formed the VBMA, and we do various things, just like you all. February through June, we have military history talks about the barracks and displays and things like that. And so upcoming, and we don't do Zoom because, among other things, we don't have the bandwidth for it. But this talk that I'm going to give you is in part what I'm going to be talking about to the average civilians visiting us in about 2 weeks. So you are my test market for this. Now, the Vancouver Barracks, this is an old picture of the sign. Vancouver Barracks, from its founding in 1849 to 2011, was the 2000 was the oldest military post north of California. And if you drive by Joint Base Lewis McChord and stand amazed at how big that facility is, in reality, that was a satellite facility for the Vancouver Barracks, stood up in World War I. And currently, the National Park Service, again, owns where that sign is. If you've ever been to the Vancouver Barracks, that's looking north. There's a split rail fence on the right-hand side. National Park Service owns everything to the right of the split rail fence, all the way down almost to the Columbia River. The city of Vancouver owns to the western portion, west of the split rail fence. And also north of that is an area called Officers Row, which is where all of the officers and their families lived. And here's a map showing the Hudson's Bay Company, Fort Vancouver. One of the things that they don't talk about in the day at the time when the U.S. Army moved in is why did these other bases, Army bases, start up in 1849 and 1850? It's because they were put not too far from the Hudson's Bay Company facilities that already existed. So the Hudson's Bay Company had the total run of the Pacific Northwest as a lucrative business, but also they were the unofficial arm of the British government administering Washington, Oregon, and was now British Columbia. And so they really, all the way up from 1812 to the 1820s, their main facility was in what's now Astoria, Oregon. And in the mid 1820s, because of political rumblings, but also just logistics, they settled at the in and around the present day stockade location of Fort Vancouver. So this is a map showing their facility, and to the south end, that's the Columbia River. And they were well established. This was a regional headquarters. They did manufacturing. They turned wrought iron into things like animal traps, and they had massive ovens to bake hardtack to be distributed throughout the Pacific Northwest. Now, this was all disputed territory until 1846, the Treaty of Oregon, the Northwest boundary dispute. And you can see on the graphic, that was the dividing line. And up until the treaty itself, there's some thought that the Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Vancouver on the north end. Let me see if my pointer shows up. Here's the Willamette River. Here's the Columbia River. And that they cited Fort Vancouver operations at the north end of the Columbia River, in part to try and justify why the border should have been drawn along the Columbia River instead of where eventually they decided the treaty following the line, really the Treaty of 1818. But that was 1846. And there were already by the early 1840s, before the treaty, there were already American settlers coming across the Rocky Mountains on the Oregon Trail. And so Congress said by 1846, after the treaty, we need to establish a series of military forts along the Oregon Trail to safeguard settlers. Unfortunately, the Mexican-American War took place, and it was another 3 years before there were enough regular Army soldiers to establish the posts, beginning, oddly enough, at the far end, which is what at the time, well, what we know today is the Vancouver Barracks. It changed names several times over the decades. So if you've heard the expression, one if by land, two if by sea, that is how the War Department established what I know as the Vancouver Barracks. And please forgive me if you've been studying up on the history, Columbia Barracks, Camp Vancouver, Fort Vancouver, all of these, the military facility had changed names several times, but for over 100 years, the military reservation was the Vancouver Barracks. So the Army sent Major John S. Hathaway, who was the artillery commander by sea, to establish the military post. They also ordered William Wing Loring, colonel of mounted riflemen. He came overland. And I don't think that they were sure who would get there first, but whoever got there first was to negotiate with the Hudson's Bay Company and start the facilities so that they could have winter quarters. So Hathaway arrived first by sea. And here is on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see there's a book called Frontier Soldier, The Letters of John S. Hathaway. And so he was the first commander at the barracks, and he came with a couple of other companies of artillery by ship, and there was a resupply ship following them, bringing finished goods such as several thousand panes of glass. Now, most people don't know who Hathaway was, and yes, I spelled his name correct as Hathaway, because he committed suicide upon returning from reassignment. Hathaway in 1853 got off the ship, uh, rented a hotel room, and he slit his throat in his hotel room. And over the years that he was here in the Northwest, many times he was caught drinking and also tried committing suicide. But his letters, that book was put together by a guy named Carl Landerholm, who's since passed on, and he lends a lot of context to the settlement here in Vancouver and the whole journey, because they went by ship. They actually stopped in Hawaii and the Galapagos Islands along the way. So you can read Hathaway's letters. But not a lot has survived because of his premature death by suicide. Now, second person who I have more records on, Captain James Theodore Talbot. He was one of the company commanders serving under Hathaway, and he kept a diary, and as well as his letters home to his mother and family members have survived and been published. And these are part of the links in blue that you can see, or you can just Google James Theodore Talbot. He went by Theodore Talbot, and another sad thing about that happened to Theodore Talbot was, and many people, and Walt and I were talking beforehand, a lot of people are interested in Civil War history, and many soldiers who served in the Pacific Northwest during the Civil War, particularly officers, became generals in the Civil War. I'm going to mention a couple. Theodore Talbot himself, by 1861, his artillery unit was stationed at a place called Fort Sumter, and Talbot was actually detached for a brief time to carry letters back and forth between the War Department and the seceding governor. And so Talbot tried, on the eve of the assault on Fort Sumter, he was carrying dispatches to the commander, and the governor of the state refused him entry onto Fort Sumter. So he returned to Washington City, and he died. According to some sources, it was a very quick onset of tuberculosis. So he himself did not live to become a general in the Civil War. But prior to 1849, he was part of Frontier Fremont's expeditions across the American Southwest and West. So his journals and letters are very interesting. He approaches a lot of things in his descriptions more like an anthropologist, as somebody who went out with these expeditions, as more of again, an anthropologist or ethnographer. He was not a West Point graduate, so his everything is different about his background from the others. Now, the interesting thing about Talbot's diary is, for instance, there was an entry in these very early days that Private X killed an Indian, and there are no details. And that is because he was so busy trying to handle the details of what was going wrong. He didn't have time to write it down in his diary. And so you then have to try and find where the official reports were. And I still haven't found those reports. I found newspaper articles on the civilian newspapers. So that's the downside of working off of somebody's diaries, is because sometimes they're way too busy to take the time writing. But if you are interested in pre-Civil War U.S. Army and military settlement in the Northwest, I encourage you to get his journals and his letters home. I think you'll find it very illuminating. Like a lot of people, you're going to read through, particularly his letters, and you're going to be saying how modern he is, and And then there'll be an entry in one of his letters or his diary where you say, wow, that I really don't agree with that. Because we're all products of our time. You see, shortly after arriving, they set up satellite post or lent support. This is the establishment of Fort Steilacoom. And in Astoria, they set up a customs house, but there was also a military presence there. So, in detailing the history and development at the Vancouver Barracks, Hathaway doesn't have much to do with it because within a few months of arriving, Hathaway and his troops were assigned to Astoria. One of the other artillery captains and his troops were sent to what we know as Fort Steilacoom, and more troops were sent to Fort Hall in Idaho. So very quickly, there was a dispersal of a lot of troops. Also, this was 1849, the time of the gold rush, and so constantly desertion was a huge problem for the army. Some men joined the army so they could get a free trip to the West Coast, and then they deserted as soon as they got here. The daily returns and the diary of Theodore Talbot detail that. And so one of the things that they had to do was they actually paid a bounty to local civilians to capture and return these deserting soldiers. And so it was a hard thing to actually do exploration. Talbot himself went on an exploring expedition and map making down into what we know as California today. And similarly, there were 1 to 3 week trips to other locations that actually took away from, I think, having all the troops spend a lot more time developing the barracks buildings. Having said that, they ended up paying extra money to soldiers in addition to their daily wage to actually work as laborers putting up the buildings. And this was all organized by a man named Rufus Ingalls, who was a captain at the time. And when Theodore Talbot and John S. Hathaway were on their way by ship to Vancouver, they ended up stopping in California, and there was the higher command was, and I'm going to get this wrong, so forgive me, was not the department, but it was not the bureau, but there was an overall command of the entire West Coast. It was based in California, and Rufus Ingalls was there. They were new too. Their facilities were new. So Ingalls arrived earlier in 1849, and he was helping organize and build these military posts in California. Hathaway and Talbot stopped and reported to the commanding general, and they were informed, and Ingalls was also ordered and informed. As soon as they set up, they'll send for you, and you're going to be the quartermaster. You're going to be the one setting up what eventually became Columbia Barracks. And so he was there in 1849. And through 1852, he was at the post. Now, late 1852, here's something that I didn't know myself until I started doing research. All these officers arriving on the West Coast, while they were getting ready to go, they signed for cash. They signed for money in cash, gold, and script. And they had their own little ledger books. And the quartermasters too. Please bear in mind, these guys are arriving, and there's nothing but land and trees and stone. So they had to buy stuff. They had to go to mills, buy lumber. They had to send for stuff. They had to pay laborers. So they all had cash to do that, but they had to reconcile their books every now and then. One of the quartermasters kept on sending letters back to Washington City saying, please let me come to the East Coast with my cash box and my ledger so that we can clear these records. It's hard to imagine today with our preconceived notions that, yeah, they still had to reconcile books. They still had to show cash and receipts. And so in late 1852, Ingalls left Columbia Barracks, left Vancouver, and returned to Washington City. He reconciled his books. And in March of 1854 through 1855, there was a major steptoe that took an overland expedition to California to the Humboldt. And then Ingalls detached himself and came back up to the Vancouver Barracks. Or I'm sorry, please bear in mind, I keep on saying Vancouver Barracks because one, I'm just so used to saying it. And two, sometimes I forget what year they changed the names of the post. So I just will continue to say Vancouver Barracks. Now, Ingalls himself, during the Civil War, rose to be chief quartermaster for the entire Army of the Potomac. He was a logistical genius, and he was the one responsible for the buildings at the establishment of the Vancouver Barracks. He was in the midst of trying to build buildings for the entire command when William Wing Loring and the Mounted Riflemen arrived October of 1849. So from May through October, they're in the midst of building. They didn't get enough built because Loring showed up with, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but in excess of 500 troops. All of a sudden show up with their hundreds of horses and hundreds of wheeled vehicles and wagons. And so they ended up having to rent space in Oregon City. They rented buildings in Oregon City to house troops, as well as housing the troops that arrived with Loring himself. And so their mission: enforce United States laws, protect U.S. citizens, particularly along the Oregon Trail. And Loring himself served for 2 years at the barracks, and he's the one who set up the genesis. Incorrectly, John Ford in all of his westerns still got something sort of right in that he set up a series of military posts, very small ones, within 1 to 3 days ride of each other by horse. And then you have some cavalry, you have some infantry stationed there, and they are waypoints so that they can travel themselves half the distance and meet troops from the other forts. The Romans did this along Hadrian's Wall too. It's called supporting distance. So Loring is one of the people who that was his idea. Now, Loring was already a seasoned command. I should have actually, this is the same slide, my apologies. But Loring himself, during the Civil War, because he was a Southerner, he ended up joining the Confederacy. When the Civil War ended, he refused to sign the loyalty oath, and he gathered many other Confederate expatriates, and they moved to Egypt for several years, where he became a Farik Pasha, which is the equivalent, I think, of a 3-star general. And he served there for several years, but he eventually came back to the United States. He is a larger-than-life person. He ran for the Senate, wrote a best-selling book, moved to New York City, but he ended up dying in 1886. And recently, he was buried in a very prominent gravestone and cemetery plot. And just in the last couple of years, his family, there were people who kind of came out and said, you know, he's an ex-Confederate, and there were threats to his gravesite. So the family actually moved his body and headstone to a family plot. I just found that a little while ago, but certainly flamboyant, larger than life. Back to Rufus Ingalls. So he wrote a report in 1849 that he sent down to the general and his superiors in California. So he'd erected 6 buildings, and some of these buildings were multi-purpose buildings. There was a headquarters building, which also was the commander's residence. There were soldiers' barracks, quartermaster stores building, and there was a multi-purpose building that served as a kitchen mess hall. And he continued this whole planning process of the next set of buildings, the next set of buildings after that. And so 1851, there is a much larger number of buildings that he got put up. And let me see what I put next. So this map that I'm showing you here is called the Mansfield map. the colonel who drew the map, or whose subordinate drew that map, this is a sketch map. Basically, the Inspector General of the United States Army every year to 2 years traveled to every single military post or major post across North America, and interviewed and inspected all the troops stationed there, and they wrote these little these little condensed reports of what's going on, who's here, and they would provide these little sketch maps. So this was not drawn by surveyors. This was done in the midst of about a 7 to 10 day visit, and there may well be similar parts of a report about Fort Steilacoom that might be available if you can tease it out through Google free books, where all these reports were rolled up and consolidated. First, the Department of the Columbia, which was Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and later Alaska, would send these reports. Every single post would send a report at the end of the year to the Vancouver Barracks. They would roll them up, and they would send that report down to California, and they would consolidate all of these from the different departments, send them to Washington City, and then the Secretary of War would roll these reports up as a national report, present it to the president, and it would get read into the congressional record. And it's a wonderful thing that we have Google free books, and we have people scanning them as a charitable effort and putting them online for free use. The bad thing, though, is there are now so many of these books and reports. We actually have to separate data, which is information, from usable data. So here is, though, the Mansfield map, and it is nice. You can tell by the mid 1850s, there are officers' quarters, soldiers' quarters, kitchen facility, hospital. By magazine and logistics, that means that there was an ordnance store. There's a guardhouse, corral for the horses, and so on. And some of these roads are still here. For instance, I would ask for a show of hands, but if you've ever been to the Vancouver Barracks, if this road that I'm slowly trying to trace, that is what we know as Fort Vancouver Way. And guess what? It's still there, and it still has sort of a bend to it. This is Northeast 5th Street. It is still there. So we are walking through history. And the cemetery listed here, at a certain point, the Army tried moving the graves to a different cemetery, and they missed some. That's one of these bad things that the Army did not do. But it's part of local history and local lore. So I would not trust this. And you notice there aren't any building plans, and it's not to scale, so you can't tell how big these actual buildings were. And so this is part of an engraving in the 1855 by a man named Richard Covington. And Covington was one of these educated elites, Englishmen, who he and his wife were hired by the Hudson's Bay Company to teach, like run a school for the children of the gentry of the Hudson's Bay Company employees. So he arrived in the mid 1840s, and he set up his own house. Well, he built a log cabin that was large enough to turn into a boarding school. That building's still alive, and it used to stand several miles outside of Vancouver. It's been moved to his current location, where I had my wedding reception there. But he also became very good friends with Ulysses S. Grant. When the Hudson's Bay Company left, he and his wife remained. And when Grant became president, Covington went back to the East Coast, where he became a patent inspector. So we are moving through history with all these people. To orient you, this is 5th Street, and there is a replica, and several buildings of the original Hudson's Bay Company fort have been recreated. And this is Officers Row. This is the top end, and this is where the original buildings that Ingalls built between 1849 and 1851 were located. And there's a little close up. So this post headquarters, this building still exists. It's known as the Ulysses S. Grant House. And on either side of the Grant House, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and you can sort of see through the tree line, 4 log cabins that were also built for officers' quarters. And over the decades, buildings were built and demolished and removed. And this is from an engraving of also around 1855. See, Covington put together his engraving for the Hudson's Bay Company because it was part of their land claim to improvements. They were supposed to get compensation for the Army because they themselves had buildings, they had wheat fields, they had cattle ranches, and they had developed in and around their Fort Vancouver apple orchards in particular. And so they demanded compensation for that. But this is done by a guy named Gustav Sohan, and it's from the same viewpoint, and it's his view of the Hudson's Bay Company. And you can see, believe it or not, the flagstaff was at least 100 feet high because they brought a 14-year-old drummer with the original artillery. And the orders that they received were to plant the colors and then establish the military reservation around it. So they ended up taking the 14-year-old drummer boy and giving him, according to lore, giving him a hatchet, a rope, and a pulley. And they had him climb to the tree, tie off the pulley, and chop off the branches on his way down. But here is what we know as the Ulysses S. Grant House. And 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 buildings. Actually, they got 5 by this time around it. So more images of the barracks. The American British commissioners of the International Boundary Commission traveled through the Pacific Northwest, taking pictures of former Hudson's Bay Company to U.S. Army sites. And so this is a picture taken, and this came from the Library of Congress, and this is from pretty close to the Columbia River, looking north. And so here is the headquarters building, and there is the flagstaff, and you can see the other buildings in between. And here's a little bit of a close-up, and you can see how big that flagstaff really is. They also took pictures inside the Hudson's Bay Company stockade. Now, this is the Hudson's Bay Company eventually abandoned their post in the late 1850s and established, guess what, Vancouver, their operations in Vancouver, Canada. And so this is the interior. The bastion did not face the Columbia River. The bastion actually faced north and west. They built it toward the end of the Hudson's Bay Company years because perhaps to discourage American settlers, even before the Army arrived, there were a lot of encroachments on land the Hudson's Bay Company felt was theirs. And so there is some thought that the management were afraid they'd be overrun by American citizens, which did not happen. But there was violence, and there were vandalism and a couple of killings related to this stress. And this was a chief factor's residence. You can see the roof is caving in by this time, and the grapevines have grown over the building. And there is a fine replica these days, and they use these photographs and building description for the replicas that they built. Now, in 1851, Rufus Ingalls sent yet another report to his commander in California, which was then rolled up with many other reports. And then that was sent to Washington City, to the War Department, which was rolled up and by the Secretary of War, presented to the president, who was the commander in chief. And he then presented it to Congress. And he talks about, by this time, they have completed the headquarters building, commander's residence. The commander's already living there with family. and the four log cabins on either side. And he talks at length about, among other things, as he's the quartermaster, he's actually living in the nicest building there because it came pre-sawn and it came with many other improvements. But here's the thing: in his note, he said that he had three employees, civilian employees, working for him, and one of them, Mr. Bomford, drew scale model maps and plans, and they were sent by private courier, separate from his report. This is Major Reynolds, and then there's no note about where they went because it's not his report, is it? And so nobody knew for sure where these maps and drawings went. Now, I was really fortunate. About 3 years ago, the Clark County Historical Museum, which has a large deposit of artifacts from across the county. Another facility, the National Park Service, now has their Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, and they have a tremendously large archive themselves. But neither one thought that they had those maps. But in the archives at the Clark County Historical Museum is a very large book, 18 by 32 inches. It is the original 1849 quartermaster logbook begun by Rufus Ingalls, where he has entries about where everything went, where the money went, who they employed as contractors, how many people they employed, and so on. And the museum is in the process of having it scanned as a searchable PDF. And to do information relevant to Fort Steilacoom, I am pretty certain that the officers sent to establish Fort Steilacoom had to come back and they had to reconcile their accounts. They had to have these orders of equipment, of lumber, of glass, of nails, and everything would have been noted down in that logbook. And it's not quite available for research, but very soon I hope it will be. But this gets back to Bomford's maps. And so I was doing research to try and get prepared to actually write up an overview for other researchers, and I looked and found a listing in the National Archives of some unscanned, not available online maps in one of their archives, and they're not dated either. And so I sent them an email saying, "Hey, how many maps are there and how much would it cost to have them scanned?" And within a couple of weeks, they sent me a response saying, "Oh, wow, we scanned them for you because we think these are significant." And so I have them in my archive. So here is the front side of drawing number one. And I will be doing a little bit of a close-up later, but you can see whoever put this together, it says Barracks Reserve and Ordnance Reserve. And I can't see it because there's the little bar showing who myself and everybody else in the conversation. But this says Columbia Barracks. And here's the Fort Vancouver Stockade headquarters building. Here is the flagstaff and 1, 2, 3, 4 buildings on either side of it. And down here is kind of the boat ship landing because all the commerce came by boat. Now there is a notation that says it's still not dated. The map's not dated, but here we've got a notation drawn by Theodore Eckerson. MSK is master storekeeper. It took me like 3 hours to find out what that meant. And approved by William T. Welker, Lieutenant Ordnance Commanding. Again, this is not dated, but in looking at it, Camp Vancouver or Camp Columbia was 1849 to 1850 as the name. It was Columbia Barracks 1850 to 53. Now, Eckerson was actually a soldier who ended up becoming a civilian. He resigned his commission, and he was in the position of storekeeper from 1853 onward. Welker was in and out of the Northwest several times in his career, but he only got promoted to lieutenant in 1855. So theoretically, based on the signatures, this map might well date to after 1855, but Columbia Barracks is 1853. So what I suspect is that this is one set of these bomber maps. He may have drawn 2 or 3 sets, and they were modified by Eckerson because, again, I can't see it very well because it's covered up by everybody's video feed. But where I'm running my mouse, there are pencil drawings, and here's a cutout of these pencil drawings. So I suspect that the Ordnance Department, which was managed separately from the rest of the Army, actually had a set of these maps from 1850 to 1853, and they modified them, and that was what was approved. This is my theory. So we are looking now. This is the commander's commanding officer's residence, and also the headquarters building. And these are the officers' houses. And what is so nifty, if I can use that term, is he's got 2 or 3 elevation drawings, and he's got floor plans. And so it is just wonderful to see sizes. These are all to scale, and in the uses. They're also troop barracks, stables, and the quartermaster ranch building as we know it. And so all of these buildings are here. And afterward, Walt, if you want, I can try and send you a link, and so you can get these. These are in the public domain, and I want people to know these things exist and to have a look at them and perhaps use them for future interpretation. And here is, even though there somewhere here it says there's a scale, here is kind of an outline. The Quartermaster Ranch building is down here, close to the Columbia River, and up here are the Officers Row, the cemetery, Hudson's Bay Company stockade. And kind of more of a close-up is the Quartermaster Ranch complex, because the next person I'm going to very quickly talk about is very famous, and everybody who comes to the Vancouver Barracks wants to know about Ulysses S. Grant. So there are multiple theories about where Grant lived. Right now, the building known as the Ulysses S. Grant House is a restaurant, is one of the few buildings open to the public. It's the oldest building, and it's the oldest surviving building. If you're down, is run by Willful Wine, so a winery and restaurant exists there. Go in, you can see and touch the historic walls. And so some of the references having to do with what I'm going to talk about are all listed here. Oh, Library of Congress photo set, HABS WA 41B. And so that's not the maps, but that's one of the later photos I'm going to show. So Grant was here September of 1852 to 53. He was the regimental quartermaster, and then gradually he was assigned duties as post quartermaster. He was only in place for about a year, and this is where he started growing his beard, by the way. And he returned again after his presidency for a couple of days to end his world tour. Here's a little bit about Grant. I have a tremendous amount of respect for him, and those people who think of Grant only as a buffoon and an alcoholic, believe it or not, after his death, there was actually a movement among Confederate apologists that actually attacked Grant's reputation, and so some of the modern attitude has to do with press that he couldn't defend himself against. But he did not actually finish his entire memoirs before he died of throat cancer. He had not finished even discussing entirely the Civil War before he finally succumbed. Uh, so, Clubhouse, Vancouver Barracks, General Grant's headquarters. So this postcard came about the year 1900, and so why did they name it the Grant House? And Grant was not the commander here. A man named Benjamin Bonneville was, and the two of them did not get along. So about the only time Grant was up in this building in the 1840s or 1850s was when he was getting yelled at by Colonel Bonneville. But the name has kind of stuck. And it's interesting. Again, it's the same building. You can't, there's been some modifications, but there's a parking lot. You can have a visit, sit on the front porch. Now, it became the Ulysses S. Grant House Museum when the Army started shrinking their presence on the post and giving away land. The officers' row and the what we know as the Grant House, that land was originally in the buildings, with this exception, were given to the VA. The Army hospital turned into the VA hospital. This was set up as a museum a couple years later, and you can see from the headline, plans to repair a building known as General Grant's quarters. And I'm not going to run the entire article for you to read, but basically the Seroptimus Club started the idea that Grant was here as a possibility, but within a couple of months, it was like accepted in civilian lore. And so where did Grant sleep? He was the regimental quartermaster and post quartermaster. This would have been the building that he slept in and lived in. And in his own the U.S. Grant papers and his letters home to his wife, he brags about this being the best building because it was certain portions of it, the lumber at least, came from California, and all the accoutrements. And attached on the outside, this is their original warehouse. And in the floor plans, you could actually go into the warehouse through an entrance on the ground floor. Some people think that this building in this 1937 photo was the original quartermaster ranch building. It's a fairly large building. And here it is. They even listed as General Grant's headquarters at Nara. And here's some more photographs they took in the 1930s before that was demolished. And it's not one long warehouse next to it. You can see these are two different building periods and also where the chimneys were all located. So side by side, even though they seem to have the same general structure, there are some big differences. Among other things, this is a 2-story building with an attic. This is a 1.5-story building with no attic. And I talked to some building folks about this, and this is people. If this were an 1849 building to the 1930s, in 80 years, yeah, buildings get modified, but usually people will jack up the roof and maybe add a half story. Very seldom do they actually cut the walls down and lower the building. And along in where the placement of the chimneys is different, the number of windows and window panes within the windows and the doors, it is different from building to building. There was a letter from Henry Hodges, who was stationed at the barracks in the 1850s. And he told his wife, or he told a newspaper reporter, oh, yeah, he wrote about the year 1900. And he said, oh, yeah, no, that Quartermaster Ranch building was demolished decades ago. So, but the debate continues. The Clark County Historical Museum authors have 3 or 4 times written articles saying, no, these are the pictures. This is the real Quartermaster Ranch. But I think this latest one, which we got from the National Archives, shows a building that's different from every other building in all these other articles. And so I still have to leave it up to everybody else to make their own decision, because to 10 years from now, somebody's going to come up with other information. So if you are interested in coming down and doing research, Clark County Historical Museum has a research library downstairs. They have an online collection of photographs. They do research. If you contact them and say, will you research this for me? They charge an hourly rate, or you can pay a minimal fee and go through their archives too. The National Park Service at Fort Vancouver National Historic Reserve. They also have archivists. They have a Friends of Old Fort Vancouver organization, and you might be able to get permission to come and talk to their archivist, or have their people do research for you, or just come down and visit as a special tourist. How am I doing on time, Walt?
You're doing better than me finding the unmute button. That's great, actually. Let's have a virtual round of applause. Or do you want to make some concluding remarks, Jeff? Or
no, everything's ongoing. I mean, we are moving through history. If you come down, you'll be moving through history. There's no ending. There's no conclusion.
One of the questions was, can you touch on the history of the old hospital?
If you're talking about the hospital building that, if you're driving south on I-5 before you hit the interstate bridge, yeah. So that was built in 1904. And that was the post hospital from 1904-ish to about 1941, 1942. Then it became an office building. And for a couple of decades, it was an Army Reserve schoolhouse. So I attended classes there, military classes there.
So why was the original fort demolished? Was it deterioration, or was it something else?
Well, it's almost like you were reading over my shoulder at a certain point, Greg, because the Hudson's Bay Company, once 1849 hit and they knew that they were going to be moving anyway, they stopped doing a lot of the maintenance on the buildings. And so they were deteriorating on their own. Imagine, even though their official leaving date, depending on who you talk to, is 1855 to 1859, they stopped putting money into fixing them. And so they were falling apart, which is why the roof of the chief factor's house was already falling in. And so shortly after these photos were taken, there was a mysterious fire. And so they all burned down. And of course, it could really be anything from kids fooling around, which happens even today, to the Army just surreptitiously, on the sly burned them down. One of the problems they had was Hudson's Bay Company had invited Christian missionaries to Fort Vancouver. And even though the Hudson's Bay Company left, the missionaries didn't. They filed competing land claims with the Army, and they were forcibly evicted from their facilities at the barracks in the 1880s. And so at times it became really contentious.
Mm-hmm. And you may have touched on this with the comment about the hospital, but for those of us who have made the poor decision to drive by and keep going, what do you actually see from the freeway? Is that the hospital you were talking about, or was that something else?
Yes, that last big brick building just before you hit I-5, or the I-5 bridge, that was the old hospital. The boundaries on the post, East and West Reserve Street, West Reserve Street, or East Reserve Street, as you're looking at me, imagine this being east, this being west, it's still there. It's 2 miles long from the Columbia River, and most of it's still there, still shown up on road maps. West Reserve Street, when they started building I-5 in the 1950s, they widened West Reserve Street. And then when they did further and further improvements in the 1970s, they widened it even more. And so there used to be a couple of brick mule barns, and now there's only one left. And there used to be a whole bunch of wooden stables, and those are gone now too. They were all demolished to make way for modern Interstate 5. Now, to jump to present day, There are plans to put a new bridge to replace the interstate bridge. And in my opinion, fortunately, Highway Department has said we're not going to take more from the east side of the Vancouver Barracks. We're not going to demolish that hospital building. Instead, we're going to go on the west side. And so there's a movie theater and banks, parking lots, and actually land that it's part of the old academy complex. That's probably going to go if they go forward with their plans to build the bridge. Now,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, keep going.
I'm actually reading the chat notes too. Melissa wanted to know how many officers lived in each of the barracks. That depends on the buildings. In the 1880s, there's a newspaper article that said, thank goodness the last of those log cabins have been demolished. As units would come in, particularly the 14th Infantry Regiment, they would go through a building phase. So the 14th arrived in 1884, 85, and they didn't leave till 1898. They built many buildings, and some of them were meant to be duplexes. Some of them could have been quadruplexes for lieutenants, or if you happen to be a major, two majors might well share these larger buildings. So it depended on what year and which rank. They had a system called ranking where the person with the highest rank got the best building. And so if somebody got promoted, there would be reshuffling over the entire post. So I am sure there was some kind of a logbook maintained by the post quartermaster about who lived there and when. But that's gone. There is one map from the 1890s that shows who lived in each building, which is why I know almost all of those were considered duplexes. If you've been to the barracks, even the small buildings, a couple of those were private or single residences, but almost all of them were just used as duplexes.
Which we have the same issue at Fort Steilacoom, really, where we don't know who was in the individual buildings. Well, you probably saw the question then. Didn't Grant hate it here? What did Grant think of the place?
It's funny. He liked the post, actually. So if you go find the Ulysses S. Grant papers, Volume 1, there's a website somewhere where it's all in digits and you can do a download. But you can go on eBay and find Volume 1 for between $20 and $120. They've collected his letters, and so he's writing to his wife Julia, who he wants to bring over, but he needs the money for the sea voyage, and so he tries all of these economic things to he bought a whole bunch of chickens and he's trying to ship them to California. The chickens all died from the heat. He planted potatoes with some other officers, and there was a flood on the river, and the potatoes all got the blight. He loaned money to people. He went into business with a former officer to open a sutler store. The guy absconded with all the funds. So when he first got there, he wrote a letter to his wife saying, this is kind of an idyllic place. Yeah, it rains a lot, but everything's green. And the native people, bear in mind, this is 1852. The native people are all friendly. If only the white settlers and government would leave them alone, we won't have any problems. And I'm trying to raise money. But toward the end, yes, he was depressed, maybe not about the surroundings, but the fact that he was there alone.
Mm-hmm. One question I wanted to ask you was, you made the comment when going back toward the beginning about the Mexican War taking place, and it's always interesting to wonder what would have happened to Pacific Northwest if the Mexican War had not taken place. But you said something, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that it took them 3 years before they had enough troops to come to. Is that literally true? Were the troops locked down, or were they dead, or were they committed elsewhere, or what? How did that work?
It was more they were committed elsewhere. Just because the Mexican War ended in 1846 doesn't mean that when the war ended, all the soldiers left. The United States Army, all the way up to the Spanish-American War, it was really an army of volunteers. Alexander Hamilton, in addition to the banking, he was the one who said we need a standing army, and it took him a long time and to actually have Congress fund a standing army. And so there was a very small regular army force from the War of 1812 on, but by and large, it was militias and volunteers, and sometimes these volunteers had 3-month enlistments. Not unusual for 3, 6, or 12-month enlistments. And so the regular army force after the Mexican-American War, they were doing garrison and peacekeeping duty for quite a while in Mexico and the Southwest as the United States consolidated its gains. And so then turning it round for Congress to fund and organize, the Army reorganized. The main fighting force was always going to be artillery, but these mounted riflemen was kind of a newer concept as opposed to what we then later on have as separate cavalry and separate infantry. And so it did. They had to finish garrison duty. They had to recall the troops, journeys of several months, and then they had to retrain, reorganize, and refund. Imagine William Wing Loring is coming with hundreds of soldiers and over 1,000 wheeled vehicles and over 1,000 animals, all traveling entirely across North America. So it just took years from 1846 to 1849 to actually make this happen.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Tom Milberg here with Fort Steilacoom. In your opinion, what do you think the relationship was between the U.S. officer or military and Hudson Bay Company?
It's interesting that that you asked that, because this is one of these again, preconceived notions and viewpoint. Absolutely, David Douglas is writing stuff about, and the other Hudson's Bayers. The U.S. Army's moved in, and they're taking up space, and so on and so forth. Like these in encroachments and some kind of unpleasant feedback that's going to London. But I find myself wondering, just like the politics of today, how many of those did he really mean, and how much of this was for political reasons? Because Theodore Talbot, also a rarity in the United States in those early days, was a Catholic, and so he attended church services at Fort Vancouver. And in his letter to his mother, he talks about how William O. Douglas at a certain point said, "Yeah, come into my house," and then he got out the cigar and brandy and tells Theodore Talbot, "You're one of us. Come on, have a good time." And so I think it's almost going to be an individual thing. You have to look at which Hudson's Bay Company person and which Army person are they talking to, as to what's public and professional and what's personal. Even Amos Short, who was one of these civilians who came in before the Army arrived, and he was encroaching on land claimed by a Hudson's Bay Company employee. They had a shootout, and he killed a couple of Hudson's Bay Company employees. But he still in his family afterward managed to work business wise, even though I don't think that William O. Douglas invited him for dinner. But you just have to hopefully find records about that. I think it was a lot friendlier than some of the overviews I've read, because there were only a couple hundred people who related as far as Euro-American culture out here in the middle of what was nowhere. So they had to get along.
So Jeff and I were talking about this before we began. Jeff has a certain protocol he follows when he gives talks about Fort Vancouver, describing his background and such. But you also have another life as an author. And I wonder, you've certainly, we'll look for more questions, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experiences as an author. And then the specific question was about, native spirits on the ground, Sarah, but you understand what people are curious about. Can you talk about that a little bit in your background?
Sure. Because I have a master's in anthropology, Anthropology is a study of humanity, and cultural anthropology relates to spiritual beliefs, quote, myths. And virtually every culture on earth believes that when we die, we don't just cease to exist. And even our Western culture, it's still an arm wrestling contest about that. And so I am not embarrassed at all to look into myths and stories about this, because even if you don't believe in ghosts, what makes a ghost story interesting is the context, is who's sticking around and why. And I do happen to believe in the possibility that ghosts exist. I've had too many bizarre things happen to me. And so over the decades, I've written a number of books on the paranormal. As I was telling Walt, I wrote Weird Washington. Well, I wrote almost 10 chapters out of Weird Washington and 6 chapters out of Weird Oregon. And many of the ghost stories came from the Vancouver Barracks. And so I do, it's historically ironic that I used to volunteer and do historic walks and talks of the barracks, sign up online and come on down. And I virtually no one show up for these, but I add in true ghost stories and charge money. And the month of October, I'm booked up. And so some of my books do include the Vancouver Barracks. I was in and out of most of the barracks buildings in my career. And even if you don't believe in ghosts, there is this relation. Now, you may find this hard to believe. I've not had anyone talk about Native American spirits at the barracks, but there are many spirits of soldiers and some civilians and family members for those married soldiers here at the barracks. There's on the parade ground, there is supposed to be the ghost of the sentry. And this relates to, there are actually 2 sentries who over the decades committed suicide there on or within the guardhouse at the parade ground, and people believe they've encountered them. Similarly, outside of the Grant House, when it was the officers club, there was a soldier at least one soldier that committed suicide by hanging themselves, coming back from deployment in the Spanish-American War. And so his body was found hanging from a tree about 30 feet from the Grant House. And so there were a lot of tragedies, children, there were little boy ghosts here and there, children's ghosts, animal ghosts too. And this, even if you don't believe in ghosts, this is part of the history, the lifestyle, and the way things just existing from the 19th century. There's a lot of diseases, a lot more diseases than we have today that took people down.
We, we have many volunteers at Fort Steilacoom who have experienced things, and it's fascinating. And I'm glad you shared that. And also, I guess if somebody wants your repertoire, they could look you up on Amazon or an independent bookseller's site. But you are quite the celebrity in that sense. People may not appreciate Fort Vancouver history as much as they should, but I'm sure you have a lot of takers on and it does humanize the history too.
I just updated my haunted tour guide, which is all across the Pacific Northwest, public places people can visit. That includes Vancouver, BC, and I just updated it as an ebook. And I didn't come on here to sell the books. I can't, I'm not that Yeah, I am that mercenary, but not this time.
No, you're the speaker. That's totally okay. I brought it up. I just think it's important. And it, number one, you are our speaker. And number two, it is part of the history, as you say. How do you want people to think of Vancouver Barracks? What's your, what do you put in the foreword of the book about Vancouver Barracks that's memorable? What does it mean?
Well, gee, that's such a simple question to answer.
Sorry,
it is
so qualified.
Well, and I am not taking away from the fact that Native American settlement here in the Northwest goes back 10, 12,000 years. But as a is a place of written history, of recorded history, chronological history. The Vancouver Barracks and Fort Steilacoom, all of these places. Somebody wrote a book and they called it One Place Across Time. And so when you are in one of the buildings at Fort Steilacoom, or even walking along Officers Row or the parade ground here at the Vancouver Barracks, you're walking through history. You are a part of history. If you do something that leaves an imprint on the landscape, you're part of that too. And so maybe future generations may know of your impact. And so, but also cherish and preserve. We're stewards of these places too. And so it's one place across time. I'll steal that from somebody else because of its multiple meanings. And so that, to me, the Vancouver Barracks is my place. It's in my blood, and I love sharing it with people, sharing its history, making them part of it, because I'm sure up where you all live too, the amount of traffic coming up the I-5 corridor from California to here, bringing in tens of thousands of newcomers to the area who don't know anything about it. Why not share it? Make them aware. Now that you're here, this is your heritage. Astoria, Oregon, up until only about 15 years ago, population never got above 20,000 people, ever. And yet you go to Astoria and talk to anybody about Astoria, like at a local bar, or they've got food court things going on. You can't tell the difference between somebody who was born in Astoria, their family been there for generations, and somebody who moved in, because they love the place and they learn the history. So that's part of kind of what my calling about the Vancouver Barracks. And I'm sure all of you involved with Fort Steilacoom, you want to make people aware this is your heritage, better and worse. We don't lie about the history, but put it in context.